Good evening, ghoulish esteemed viewers. Tonight, we join Detective Ryan Dimstar as he attempts to solve the strange disappearances involving Applewood Ranch. If you enjoy spine-tingling stories like this, don't hesitate to creep up on that subscribe button and give it a scare, and remember to like this content and turn on notifications as I have more original horror tales coming your way. Now, let's get back to the scares.
Detective Ryan Dimstar was no stranger to missing persons cases, but he had never investigated one steeped in supernatural claims. On his way to Applewood Ranch, he interviewed several people in the surrounding area, including the owner of a rehabilitation center that sat just outside the path to the ranch. There, he met Larissa. He opened a conversation about the missing people and questioned her about how they were last seen there, before they went missing. Larissa sighed and said, "The forest has a way of seducing people to venture into it. Anyone who goes there almost certainly never comes back." With a chuckle, the detective replied, "Let me guess, a magical witch lives there? Please spare me, I've heard the stories." She responded, "Then let me tell you another story. It's about my uncle. He was locked up for 40 years, and during those years, he was convinced that someone or something was going to steal his coffin. The family thought he was crazy after being in there for so long. A few days after we buried him, we got a call from the police saying there had been a grave robbery of my uncle's coffin. We thought this had to be some sick joke because everyone knew of what he feared most. But what was strange was that they found pieces of wood, deep in the ground, with scratch marks resembling canine prints that seemed too large to be from a dog." She continued, "You see, detective, there are some things in this world that just can't be explained." "Fascinating story," he replied. "When I find out what's going on here, then maybe, just maybe, I'll solve your uncle's case as well, to show you that everything has a reasonable explanation," he concluded, ending the conversation. Ryan drove down the winding road leading to the ranch, unable to shake the eerie feeling that enveloped the place. The sun hung low in the sky, indicating that nighttime was upon him. Irritated, he thought to himself, "Why me?" He had a phobia of insects, and the woods were alive with them, buzzing, crawling, and skittering at the very edges of his vision. He gripped the steering wheel, trying to focus on the task at hand. Upon arriving at the Applewood Ranch, Ryan was greeted by tall grass and thick fog surrounding a decrepit cabin in the middle of the woods. As he approached the dilapidated structure, he could smell a stench of rotting flesh surrounding it. He noticed the windows were dirty and had broken glass. As he climbed the creaking stairs, he could hear breathing on the other side of the cloth hanging from the door. He felt his heart racing when he discovered a pair of dirty, pale feet peeping out motionless, beneath the tattered cloth. Cautiously, Ryan drew his weapon, terrified of whoever, or whatever, was behind the cloth. Before he could release the safety, he heard a creepy old raspy voice say, "That won't do you any good here, detective." With absolute terror in his voice he said, "Don't be so sure," as he raised his gun high, pointing it toward the cloth. He asked, "Are you the big bad witch I've been hearing about? Did you have anything to do with the missing people who come out here?" He yelled. But his questions were met with silence, as if his words fell on deaf ears. Still, the set of feet remained, unmoving as if it was rooted to the ground by some unnatural force. Scared, a chill crept down his spine, awakening a fear he thought he'd outgrown. He breathed heavily, feeling his body shaking as if it was telling him to turn back. With trembling hands, he reached for the cloth hanging in front of him, pulling it back with a swift motion. But there was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, just an unsettling emptiness. Confused, he shined his flashlight into every dark corner while simultaneously holding up his badge. "This is the police," he yelled, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was hiding behind the cloth. But there was nothing, no one, only a bed with dirty linen, a table adorned with flickering candles, strange symbols scrawled on the walls, and animal bones dangled from the ceiling. Just then, he heard a heavy thud above him, almost as if they were taunting him. Slowly, he headed out the door to check it out. As he pointed his weapon towards the ceiling, he was met with a bee that stung him, forcing him to drop his badge. Staring at the top of the cabin, he could find nothing, only the decaying roof. Now scared, he decided to leave. But then he saw her, a figure in the distance. At first, it was just a silhouette against the fading light, but as she drew closer, the details emerged. It was an old lady with her skin stretched tight over her bony limbs. Her gaze was hollow as the light reflected off of her eyes. Her hair, wispy and wild, floated around her head as if it was caught in a breeze that didn't exist. With every step, the air turned colder, and the forest grew unnaturally silent, as if it was holding its breath. She raised one gnarled finger, pointing it directly at him, as a sinister smile creeped across her cracked lips. In that moment he realized with a shudder that he was no longer just a visitor, he was prey. With a deep breath, Ryan stepped into the woods, with the rustle of leaves and the hum of insects surrounding him. Each step felt heavier, as his phobia intensified with every buzzing sound, sending unwanted chills across his body. He could almost feel the gaze of something sinister upon him. As dusk fell, Ryan found himself lost in the woods, as the forest grew denser around him. He thought to himself, how could this get any worse? Frustrated and hungry, he saw a tree in the distance, that appeared to have fruit on it. As he drew closer to it, a strange whispering could be heard, that seemed to gather around him, teasing at the edges of his sanity. "Help me. Help us," they seemed to plead, but Ryan couldn't see anyone. But he could feel their presence around him, lingering, in the dead of night. Suddenly, the silhouettes of the figures materialized just beyond the tree. Their outlines were blurred and indistinct, but above all, they were haunting. Panic surged through him as he yelled, "This is the police." The words echoed back, almost as if something was mocking him. His voice cracked, morphing into a desperate plea. "Please, I need help getting out of here." But the figures remained silent and stale, appearing lifeless, the closer he got to them, as if they were dead already. But how could they be? He cried, with tears running down his face. He shouted, "Don't just stand there, say something." He could feel his heart on the verge of an attack as it pounded faster and faster. Just then, a cold hand brushed against his shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through his spine. But when he spun around, there was no one there, and the ghostly figures that once stood there, vanished. With all hope lost, he sat on a rock, slowly dozing off. But just as he was about to slip into a deep sleep, a voice broke through the silence, "Follow me." He opened his eyes to find a short, bony woman with gray, wispy hair standing before him. Scared, he instinctively drew his weapon, aiming it towards her. "What did you do to me?" he shouted, unsure if this was all a figment of his imagination. The woman grinned, with an unsettling expression. "Poor detective, you're the one trespassing on my land." With a flick of her frail hand, a swarm of animals emerged from the shadows, encircling him. Panicking, he shot in the air in hopes that it would scare them away. But it had the opposite effect as a dog lunged at his arm, forcing him to drop his gun. Crows swooped down, and with its sharp beak it pecked at his flesh, and another managed to claw one of his eyes. As he collapsed to the ground, the witch moved towards Ryan, and said, "You see, detective, people come here for all sorts of reasons, to commune with the dead, to cultivate the land, or, in your case, to find the missing." Her gaze bore down on him as he felt his body becoming soft and spongy. She continued, "But what you fail to understand is, that this is my forest, and no one trespass without paying the toll, whether it be blood, sacrifice, or, perhaps, their very soul." Panic surged through him as he felt himself shrinking. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. Desperately, he swung his arms, only to realize they were transforming, right before his very eyes. His limbs started to become soft and malleable, his vision narrowed. He looked down in horror to see a vibrant green body, tiny legs, and delicate antennae sprouting from his head. He wanted to scream but his voice was lost. He could only hear the frantic buzzing noises of the swarming insects around him. He crawled toward the witch, desperate for her to reverse his curse or, at the very least, to end his existence. As he couldn't bear living like this. She scooped him up in the palm of her hand, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like she might crush him. Instead, she placed him gently on a patch of grass and walked away, sealing his fate forever.